So the focus of the previous hours is enjoyment, whereas I'm going to put my focus into saturation. Because I think we propose three sections for reading, and I think I suggested two sections for saturation. And actually, if we look at the type of contents of totality and infinity, I see that saturation is scattered around the book. Section 1 of the B, part B, saturation and its cause. And section 2, part A, saturation as life. And then I think you can still find saturation and the last part of section 2 of saturation is economy. Right? So
can you please speak a little bit louder?
A bit louder, yes, I will try.
Thank
you. So saturation, so nothing important. I just say there's some sections with the focus on saturation. So I will try to put the focus a bit more on saturation. I will start with a few words as a kind of an introduction to the theme of saturation, because it seems that saturation is one of the key concerns of Leibniz, infinity. And I think actually he explicitly explains this in one of the sections. Section 1 of part D, saturation and the absolute. Saturation and the absolute. So in this section, in this part Leibniz pointed out that the theme of saturation has been ignored in the history of Western philosophical tradition. Since Parmenides to Spinoza, to Spinoza and Hegel, he said, not until Spinoza to Hegel, but Spinoza and Hegel, unity. So the stress has been unity. Unity has always been given priority and ultimate importance, while saturation is regarded as something incomprehensible, inferior, negative, and lacking in perfection. Separation can at most be one stage of the way in which the subject finally attains unity. Traditional metaphysics has not done justice to separation in its positive sense. So this Leibniz view, so separation has been regarded as something negative, something inferior, while he wants to do justice to separation in its positive sense. So what stands behind such a negative view of saturation? For Leibniz, that is to view saturation as deriving from need. What has a need is regarded as insufficient and thus depends on the exterior. It needs something from the outside to fill in its lack. For Leibniz, this is not the true saturation. He gives a grand example of separation. So the separation between the good and essences. The good is a beyond. Instead of need, it has desire that does not stand for lack. The infinite does not embrace such a negative, such a separate being in itself. To the contrary, it is due to the proximity with this being that the infinite accomplishes its infinitude. So for Leibniz, saturation is not a fall from the infinite, but the traditional Western philosophy for him, so saturation has been presented as a fall from the infinite. So this is a brief introduction to the theme of the importance of saturation in us, totality and infinity. Now I'm going to section, or my section is C3 of section 2, enjoyment and saturation. So I think like the otherwise than B, section 1 of totality or infinity is something like the argument of the book, while other sections are the exposition of the argument. Part 1 of Levinas wants to show that separation is already at work in interiority, in enjoyment. From the very beginning of section C3, C3, we see that separation occurs when I, moi in French, the moi and the I enjoys the contents from which it lives, which does not constitute an object. So that means it's not the relation with the nutrients, with the elements. It's not intentional relation. Unless it's kind of a cognitive intellectual relation. So it's not. This means that the relation between I and what I enjoy is not cognitive intentional. Here there's one sentence, Saint-Guy came to translate into English Saint-Guy, but I think in French there's not a strict distinction between whether it refers to a person or to something. So it seems that here the Saint-Guy we can also read as a kind of reference to something, refer to the elements, to the food, perhaps. I think that it's
Which one? Sorry.
Yeah,
Salut-Guy. It's not in the English.
Yeah, but where was the celery? Where?
In English,
French,
Which page?
talking about French 121.
so it's the first page, the French version I have, the 157.
And what, it's about 8 or 9 points there?
It's like
What's the English?
the English in the middle of the first paragraph.
Yeah.
Here, there is an emphasis.
Food is not unwritten.
Is the way of being. Is the way of being of in who.
In who?
So in French is celui
And then here that was the celery key.
Celui qui.
Celery key. N'est pas celui.
I don't know. But the same like the one that reads as well. So refers to the food. So represents the way of being of that which, or if in English, or if it's a thing, something of that which is not simply posited, but posits oneself, So if we read in this way, we can interpret this sentence as something like this. As if here it looks as if the elements, the food, assumes autonomy. Autonomy will simply consume food. The food is something that satisfies our desire, our needs. But for Levinas, as if here the elements, the food, well, it's not completely subject to moi, not subject to I, but it has its own autonomy. To give an example, it is not. It is something like the food is also determinative of the way in which it should be enjoyed. So regarding different food, we have different way of consumption, right? We use a spoon to eat soup, or we use a knife and fork to eat roasted meat, chopsticks to eat rice. So I think, so here for me, it sounds like that it's not that I, the subject, completely determines what is to be enjoyed, what he lives from, but the contents of what I enjoy also determines the way in which it has to be consumed. So that's why Levinas says positive oneself.
Isn't there a problem that between the raw and the cooked that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's why it's here. If we take in a more ground view, it's first very general to just water and nature, but in reality, actually, we don't consume that. Apart from regional transition.
There's nothing in rice that suggests that it has to be eaten with chopsticks or a fork.
Mm-hmm.
And rice is not a natural given. It has to be prepared and cooked.
Yes.
So I'm not following.
Yes. Yeah, for me, I think for Levinas, even if he's writing like as if it is something elemental, it's the kind of raw things, like people here are wild man, and all the cooked fruits, the habitation comes later. But as I read it, perhaps we can read Levinas in a way in which different parts of this book is interpenetrated. So something that comes later in his writing will already show itself in the early section.
There's no question that's true. Everything is operative at once. I said that's one of the reasons why it's so different.
Yes.
And that's why here, when Lingus translates the suppose, he posits himself later in otherwise than being, he'll call it the one self. So the other issue is the attachment to a technical vocabulary. It's a matter of knowing what Levinas is up to. He's talking about the self-constitution, the self, whether one says himself or oneself. So the Levinas is very attached to the suppose, because the su is the reflexive, the origination of the self and the reflexivity. So he could have said herself, or oneself, or himself. I think Lingus is focusing on the natural himself, which is the neutral term in English, because he wants to give it a person, the character of personality. But later, in otherwise than being, he will go with oneself. Yeah.
Attacked by feminists.
I think it could be used to attack non-feminists. I think it's a very feminist philosophy, but that's another debate.
Levinas, what Levinas wants to stress here is that individuality itself is already separation. So individuality involves and is separation. In enjoying fruit, one is individuated and thus separated from the rest of the world. So now I come to the second paragraph about happiness. So this point about this individuality and separation is brought up more clearly. In the happiness of enjoyment, there is enacted auto-personification, the substantialization and the independence of the self. The self is swa. I think I need to review until here. I'm not sure, but I think Levinas didn't make a strict distinction between moi and swa. But he did in
Moi and swa?
Yeah, moi and swa. The I and the self.
Well, he really bounces around. Because sometimes when you want to say moi, you say ego. So I know, but it never. You can never say by separating the word from the context what it is. So sometimes the moi would be ego, and sometimes the ego will be a moi. Yeah, that's a
straight distinction between the two.
Yeah.
So they are not synonyms. So happiness already, for Levinas, already exceeds the ontological order. So he said that in another place, in page 119, section, here. So he says that one becomes a subject of being not by assuming being, but enjoying happiness, by the interiorization of enjoyment, which is also an exaltation, and above being, so this is exaltation. So happiness for Levinas is already exaltation, as if it is something like more than ontological, so that play happiness.
Makes sense.
Something that's more than ontological, it's happiness. So along the same line, the moi, the I, is as if I'm coming to this. So I'm coming to this section in the production of a being that is born. 148 first paragraph. So So here, the production of being that is born. So this sentence, I think, reminds us of Leibniz's discourse on position from existing to distant. Position is born.
Page 148 in the top.
Born in
I see it. I
47.
think it's the previous section.
Yeah, it's previous.
You're talking 147, and it's a great sentence. You're right.
148.
The business of being born? Where?
Yeah, I think it's
It's
It's the bottom of 147.
Yeah.
Yeah, 147.
Yeah, 147.
Yeah. And it's a very important sentence.
Yes.
Enjoyment is the reproduction of being that is born.
It's born.
And then look at what Levinas does here. That breaks the tranquil eternity of its seminal or uterine existence to enclose itself in a person who, in living from the world, lives at home with himself. So instead of sort of hiding, as it were, this concrete idea of uterine existence, that would be the elemental, that would be the Iliad, existence without existent. And this image of a baby, the enjoyment, the self-sensing, is a very powerful image of what he wants to say. And it's not just an image. It's an image, but it's not just an image. And that's one of the beautiful things in Levinas. He will do that. It's not exactly a metaphor, right? It's both real and a metaphor. It's a very powerful abuse of language that. So that when he talks about feminine presence, we'll find it's not biological. It doesn't even have to be a female, right? But he'll say feminine presence. So he'll say uterine existence. So that would be like insomnia. That would be like the night. It's a beautiful image of the and then the baby. Very beautiful, and not just an image. You don't know what to do with these things, right? I'm sorry, I just love it.
So the acquiring of personhood happens in an instant. Symbol is early from existence to existent. So at the same time, it is also the achievement of the it's kind of achievement of the relation between I and the being.
Can you hear back there? Can you hear?
Can you little more louder?
Okay. The instinct in Leibniz's early work is independent, as we know, it's independent, eventful, and does not have necessary connection with other moments of life. It is in this sense that Leibniz speaks of diachronia. So the instinct is cut radically from the past and the future. So along the same line, the I is as if newly born from the uterus. In every instant, the past is somehow relived, so Leibniz says, relived, reconstituted as part of the content of enjoyment. The essence of the past consists in the fact that the I is separated, relieved from the very past. So as if it's free. Leibniz presents happiness as the marvel of good time. So think of marvel. Marvel is an instant. It's an instant. It is a moment in life. It's not the continuity, the awe of life, the awe of history. So it's a moment. So happiness is the marvel of good time, as contrasted with the homogeneous continuity of the hours, the ordinary sense of time. So in his early book, From Existence to Existence, Leibniz has a criticism of Bergson's idea of duration. So for him, Bergson is a revolutionary putting forward this concept of duration. But Leibniz thinks for him, all the instincts interpenetrate with one another, so the emphasis on the instant, on the sudden eventful nature of the instant is not yet characterized very well as Bergson. So he wants to emphasize the notion of instant as some event, something new. Certainly has some connection with the past, but different. And so this is 148. In the following, Leibniz opposes his idea of separation to the conception of the otherness in Hegel's speculative system. I think it's 148, the second paragraph. So he's criticizing Hegel. Hegel is one of the philosophers who has written about otherness. So Leibniz writes humanity and infinity somehow against. With Hegel, otherness is produced as an antithesis of a thesis. It will finally be integrated into a synthesis and disappear after Leibniz. Finally, there's no true sense of otherness in Hegel. With Leibniz, the relation between the separated being and the infinite is not dialectical. It's not dialectical. It's not the Hegelian sense of otherness. None is deduced from the being. One, you have the separated being, another you have the infinity. So none is deduced from another. So they don't form a logical relation. Their relation is don't form a closed circle, as in the case of Hegel. The circle of dialectic movement for Leibniz ultimately points to the identification of the I and the non-I. So here's very clear his criticism of Hegel. Then after this paragraph, Leibniz points out that the self-closure of interiority does not block. Leibniz does not block the exit to exteriority. So first he emphasizes the separation as independent, as self-sufficient, enjoying their life, enjoying the elements, but he points out that this separated being is not completely closed. It also has an exit for exteriority. Otherwise, the other cannot speak to the separated being. The other cannot show itself to the separated being. So this is a double-sidedness in this separated being. On the one hand, it is closed in the sense that it has to be real, and pursue its own destiny in an egoist atheism. It is at the same time open. So Leibniz uses in the foregoing. Written on the contents imperative in the foregoing. So why it has to be open? What are the conditions or possibility for this openness? That's not easy, as if it's just something that we have to start with. So in the foregoing, there must be in interiority the apparition of a heteronomy in the shock. This shock.
I'm not understanding. Were you saying in a folga?
In the foregoing.
Like you must.
Oh, in folga. I'm sorry. In folga. And the answer is the flesh. The flesh is both open and closed.
Oh yes, it has to be. It is closed, but it's also open. After so much talk about self-sufficiency, it's really not self-sufficient. It's not just self-sufficient in a different sense. So this shock, so it means there will be the apparition of the heteronomy in the shock. This shock does not invert the movement of interiority, does not change the substance of it, but it will provide an occasion for a resumption of relations with exteriority. This is Leibniz's own words on page 149.
This will be very important later when we talk in the third session on Thursday about trauma. Right? Trauma is a shock. And it's a shock that's already occurred. It's too late. The traumatized being is always too late for the trauma. That's why it's a trauma. You can't recover from a trauma. Or as Richard Kearney was saying, you can't cure a trauma. You can heal it, but you can't cure it. And this is the image that Leibniz falls upon when he wants to flesh out shock. But we're getting it right now, right at the very beginning. Remember, deepening the separation of the subject in order to heighten the transcendence of the other.
But such a shock can be poison. Really,
It is.
Yeah, usually when we talk about trauma, talk about unpleasant. For example, if we win the lottery tonight, we become trillions. And so a shock, it will be a shock, but it's a poison.
Miraculous. Since I haven't bought a ticket.
I think that Derrida defines trauma as something that is at the same time too early and too late. It is too early to understand it. It takes me by surprise. I cannot cope with it. It's too much for me.
Right.
And it's in the same time too late, as you said.
I think people don't appreciate that Derrida took the notion of trace from Levinas. And
Yeah,
this is the
that's right,
structure.
that's
This
right.
is the structure of a trace.
Yeah, yeah,
Too early, too late,
Yeah.
at once.
yeah.
And yet, not at the same time. Yeah. But we'll get back. I just wanted to underline when we bring in this word shock, how much this is going to mean to us later.
So the relation with the other is as if the condition possibility for egoism. This relation is discovered. This suggested later assumption as if it's discovered after the fact, as if it's the after, but it actually precedes egoism. But this does not affect the self-sufficiency of the I. With the separated being and existent I, the happiness of its enjoyment is greater than all disquietude. Suicide. In this section, Magnus mentioned again suicide. Suicide.
Let me go back, because I want to go to what you said about disquietude, if you don't mind. Because he says it's something that's important. Because up to now, we've been talking about the human as if it's an animal. And he says, the disquietude that can trouble it, it is here that lies the gap between the animal and the human. So that the human will respond to that disquietude with labor, possession, representation. The animal won't. Right? So this is, well, it's actually Bergson spoke of bees as having a better social organization than humans. But he characterizes that as instinctual work as opposed to the human labor, which is production and creation, which is not instinctual. So the difference would be there. We're not talking about organization, but response to disquietude. And this distinctively human response is this. Remember too, again, what Lin Ma mentioned, and I mentioned too, that we will talk about labor now as if we're in the sphere of immanence, but labor occurs within the social environment. It occurs within an ethical context, so that it won't be so hard to characterize what's different about human labor, because the ultimate difference between humans and animals is the ethical. That will be the distinguishing mark. That is, we're not going to say, oh, humans are laboring beings and animals aren't, or humans are laughing beings and animals aren't, or humans are, all these different rational beings and animals aren't. These all get us into trouble.
I think it's killing is a crime. That's how we say
Murder,
those are not
right?
good.
Animals do not know murder,
Yeah.
right? And ethics will be the distinguishing mark. Yeah. So that, but still, Levinas is aware that so far we're almost at an animal level with this enjoyment. I think what.
Does Levinas speaks this as an essential characteristics of human species?
Ethics.
This labor and possession and representation.
I'm saying that because labor and possession take on their full sense within an ethical context, then they are fully human, yes. But not in and of themselves.
And there is a Nietzsche's criticism in this regard. And he says genealogically how human beings are made into laboring animals. And animals who keeps possessions. It was how it happens in the genealogy of morals. In the second essay, Nietzsche's how human beings are made into laboring animals,
Right.
and animals who possess things. How this happens? This is as if this is not an essential characteristics of human being, rather one propagated
Right.
through this.
It's a good point, and I think this is another thing wrong there in Nietzsche, because he's talking there about the master-slave dialectic. Master-slave dialectic. So that the master in Nietzsche doesn't possess. They just take and give and take, and they don't have a home. They're nomadic. And that comes from Hegel, as from Kojel's reading of Hegel. The master actually does nothing, and the slave labors. So that for Nietzsche, the labor is not essential to the human condition, whereas for Levinas it is. For Levinas, laboring is part of the human condition. It's not just the slave, in contrast to the master. It's human. So if that's the point, is that the point you want to make, or am I?
No, I was just making a
different
distinction. While Levinas makes this as an essential characteristic of human beings,
Yes, that's right.
It could be seen from another angle as well.
Right.
I was just pointing out that.
No. That's good. That's why I'm saying that I'm sharpening your distinction. I'm
Okay.
saying, yes, for Levinas, that is part of the human condition. And why for Nietzsche it's not. Because Nietzsche is building on the master-slave dialectic. And Levinas is
You
not.
mean to say Nietzsche is building upon Hegelian idea of master-slave dialectics?
Yes,
Yeah, it's very doubtful.
sure. I'm not saying he's Hegelian,
Okay.
but he's building on the Hegelian notion of master-slave. Anyway, we can debate that.
This is not debatable at this
But
moment.
regardless of that point, your initial point is quite correct. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Back to the
Back to the animal? No, we're passing the animal. I went back to the animal. You're going on to suicide, right?
I would like to follow up your
Oh, back to the animal, yes.
because here's there lies the gap between the animal and human. Does Levinas actually suggest animal has no face in this sense?
No,
So that's
but contrary to a lot of mushy thinking about we are all the walrus, Levinas does want to distinguish between the animal and the human. He wants to make that distinction. Why not? There we go. Doesn't mean you kill animals and kick them and mistreat them, but he makes a distinction.
What does an animal have? Does he have I can maybe I'm confused.
Well, Raymond's raising the issue of the face.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
another issue. We haven't even got to the face. Thursday we did. There's no face yet. Faceless
we're
people.
going to talk about it because here he said the happiness of enjoyment is stronger than every desired
Yes.
trait.
Yes.
So in that sense, if the animal has face, then does Levinas saying the human face is clearer than animal's face?
Not answering until Thursday.
Okay, back to here. We talk about this before, but just go back to the difference between the animal and humans.
Right. This is the big issue now. Everyone's talking about it. I think it's so. I'm sorry.
Or suicide.
Suicide.
Back to
Not a lot, but just one small point that is here. So, Levinas says suicide in its essence is for the purpose, actually, it is for the purpose of the happiness of life. So we can think of this intuitively. Either one is relieved from the torture of all suffering by committing suicide, it's possible. Or other people may be saved if one sacrifices one's life. So in this sense, Levinas says that suicide and sacrifice are at the same level. So they are at the same level. They both indicate the possibility of a metaphysical being. Both testify to the radicality of the love for life. So suicide is not a kind of negation of the joy of life, but it is in order to avoid the suffering of life, in order to have happiness, to have quietude of life. something like this idea.
Well,
For the atheist.
I agree with you, but I think that he's trying to say more than that. When he's saying that suicide appears as a possibility to a being already in relation with the other, already elevated to life for the other. So suicide, it's not only to avoid being unhappy, but suicide is the mark, maybe the first mark of a relationship to the other. And this is very interesting because he connects here some interesting ideas, the idea of sacrifice with the idea of suicide. So this is not something something obvious. It's not at all something obvious. Spinoza, for example, would condemn suicide.
No.
Spinoza?
He explicitly says in a letter that if this was someone's conatus ascendi, they should commit suicide. Someone wrote to Spinoza, said, they said to Spinoza, then how can you condemn suicide? And Spinoza was shocked by this. But in the end, he admitted.
It's the Stoic idea for like.
Yeah, it's one.
Well, in the ethics, he objects, he strongly objects
Yeah.
the idea of suicide in the ethics.
Yeah, he was forced to eat his words. He was. I can show it to him. I'll bring it in the next class. I have one.
No, I haven't read it.
I mean, not the actual letter, but I have a printed version of it. But so the problem is that Spinoza can't say that. That's the problem.
Yeah.
But you're right. When you get to suicide and the relation with the other, this face that someone's talking about, then your suicide takes on a different meaning. You don't control your own suicide. You don't control the meaning of your suicide. And we all know the horror of suicide is it leaves everyone else traumatized. Right? The person who commits suicide is gone. Everyone else is traumatized. They've done this to everybody else. They thought they were doing it like Camus, that you're taking possession of your own life. But no, you're taking possession of all these lives that will have to live on and suffer because of what you did. And sacrifice is similar too. That is, when he talks about,
It's
you
similar,
can control your own,
it has another.
the meaning of your death. The other person can control.
Yeah.
But it's very rich. But I think here, I think it is the case that the connection between suicide and sacrifice is both are still done in the name of the love of life. That is,
Precisely.
Yeah.
But more than that, it signifies an already elevated life for the other. This is for me interesting, and this is for me somehow hard to understand why through suicide you can open yourself to the other. And I think that here comes the idea of sacrifice. I mean, here comes the idea of giving. Because what is the purpose of sacrifice? The purpose of sacrifice is to give something. The ultimate sacrifice is to give your life. So until now, the ego, the I, was the one who was enjoying everything, who was feeding upon everything, who was not preoccupied by giving something. Yeah.
Right.
And this comes this idea of sacrifice and of suicide. And I think that this is the first, by this idea of suicide, you first get a glimpse on what it's like to enter into a relation to the other. Because to enter into a relation with the other means to give. This is...
It's very important because...
I think still suicide, here I have not mastered it. In the text he says, suicide and sacrifice are connected. There are some similarities between them, but still suicide and sacrifice are two different emotions.
It's one
I
thing.
think
I
it's
also
also
another.
Yeah, I didn't say they were not two different.
Yeah, but from what you said, I'm not sure I agree. It seems like you treat suicide as a precondition for life for the other. But I think that's not correct.
No, it's not a precondition.
You don't have to have an idea. Actually, he says it appears as a possibility to a being who is already, well, let's make it short,
Being already in a relation
for
with
the other. So to have a notion of a suicide, a meaningful notion of a suicide, you have to be for the other. But it's not a precondition for being for the other. It's only a person who lives for the other can start thinking as a possibility, can even get the notion of committing suicide. But I think that's all you're saying. The way you phrased it, it seemed that suicide or idea or notion of suicide is a precondition to getting to this living for the other. And I'm not sure that I agree.
That would obviously be wrong, because when you commit suicide, there is no more you, so it can't be a precondition for a relationship with the
but
other.
we're talking here now as a possibility.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I agree with you. I think we're saying the same thing.
No, but it's interesting that he's now beginning, I mean, he inserts the notion of the other, the full other, right here.
Yeah.
And first of all, it strikes me, this is an allusion to Camus, right? Camus, who is in The Rebel, defining the human as the being who can leave, who can commit suicide, who has control of his life. And he's saying, this is not the case. So that on the one level, suicide and sacrifice are the same because both indicate a little life. Why does he introduce the other, though?
Yeah, that's the
And this is very important, because alterity in Heidegger comes in as the alterity of my death. I will never know the when of my death. The strongest sense of transcendence in Heidegger, oddly enough, is not being with others. Being with is part of my existential makeup.
That's right, yeah.
It's the alterity of death. I have to face up. I am anxious before death because I never know when.
Yeah.
Now, for Levinas, again, keep in mind, his antagonist is Heidegger. So he's talking about death and suicide, and he brings in the other, because the strongest sense of death for Levinas is the mortality of the other. It's not my mortality that is weighing on me. My mortality, that's something else. But the mortality that the other might die, that I could sacrifice my life to save the other. That's the ultimate meaning of death for Heidegger. And Levinas makes this explicit in his later work. It's dying for the other. That is, the being for the other, pour l'autre, becomes dying for the other. And why do you die for the other? Because the other is mortal. Right? So this confrontation with Heidegger at the level of death is the most important confrontation, because death functions so powerfully to waken up Dasein to its ontological status. Death wakens up Dasein, just like in Kierkegaard, it wakes you up. So when Levinas is saying, on the one hand, even if you think about what Camus is saying about suicide, we'll see later, suicide is interpreted by the survivors. You don't control yourself in your own suicide. But there's nothing noble about suicide. You're taking your own life. But when you die for another, that's the ultimate meaning of being for the other, the ultimate meaning of death, and therefore we can only think of this as the ultimate sacrifice in terms of the relation to the other. And that's why he has to insert the other. So I think Paul is very right to be sensitive to why all of a sudden we hear about the other right here. And it's right because death is the issue. Again, back to Spinoza. Spinoza says famously that the thing he thinks least about is death. And the reason he doesn't think about death is because there is no death in Spinoza. In Spinoza, there's what an individual is a ratio of motion and rest. That's what an individual is. And human individuals are complexes of ratios of motion and rest. That is, your liver has one ratio of motion and rest, your heart has another ratio, the combination of your whole body has a particular ratio, and death is simply the reconfiguration of these ratios. That's it. That's all it is for the person who has intellectual love of God. Now, for those people living in their emotions and fears, they're afraid of death, but they're ignoramuses. For the people who know how things work, it's simply a transformation of matter and movement. So there's no fear of death in Spinoza. And so Levinas wants to insert that there's a different way in which he doesn't think about death. He doesn't think about death the way Heidegger thinks about death. Right? He has his own idea about death, which is dying for the other. So it's not this obsessional my death, this kind of Kierkegaardian morbidity and especially Heideggerian morbidity, in a certain way Christian morbidity. I'm not saying all Christians have to think this, but after all, the central figure is dying in Christ. And Levinas is making this life affirmation that you can even go so far as to die for another. It's extraordinary. So absolutely, that is a remarkable insertion of the otherness right there. Now sometimes we don't notice this, and I think we do notice in Levinas. You can see the way he writes, he prepares you for where he's going. He'll insert something, and then 3 sections later, all of a sudden that becomes the important thing. But another reason why we don't always pick up on it is, as I said, the very structure of the book. The section 1 are the results. Right? He gives you the results first. Section 2 is working your way through the labor of thought. Section 3 is the labor of thought, recognizing the transcendence. Section 4 is one of the hardest sections anybody else ever wrote, and I'm not sure I understand it, so we'll put that aside. That and Section 2 of Otherwise Than Being have me stumped. But the Section 1 is clarity itself. I mean, it's like, oh, how wonderful! You can live in Section 1 without doing any work, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a mind buster when you first read it, but.
I was going to say, tell that to my undergraduates.
No, I understand that. But once you've worked your way, like we are, through Section 2 and Section 3, you go back to Section 1, you go, I get it, right? But then sometimes we're not always attentive, like Paul was right now, to that other coming in, because most of us have read Section 1. But I always say, skip Section 1, go to Section 2. Right?
One more count. Also, I feel the suicide has to be distinguished from sacrifice. In the case of sacrifice, it is a gift of my life I given to the other, and it is the substitution of oneself for the other comes in. Whereas suicide, at every time, comes out of narcissism, one's own self-love. And on that count, there is clear distinction between suicide and sacrifices.
Yes, and I think that's why when you shift from the level of life to the relation to the other, suicide falls into the category of the survivor. Other people are going to suffer for your suicide. Other people are going to interpret your suicide. This is not how to get a grip in your life. This is narcissism to the limit, right? As opposed to sacrificing for the other. So it's a very strong opposition. Yeah. That's why you're so grateful that Levinas was able to complete his work. Because would we have picked up all this if we had not gotten Otherwise Than Being and his later writings? I've said this in other videos. His work is a process of extrapolation and elaboration. So 5 words in this book become a paragraph in the next book. And the paragraph in that book becomes a whole article in the next production. It's this kind of blossoming, this blooming, and then you can look back and you can say, this is why there are some people who want to make a sharp distinction between totality and infinity and Otherwise Than Being, as if something drastic had happened. First of all, Otherwise Than Being was written right after Totality and Infinity. I mean, the center part of it is written in 1968, so it's a continuity of the writing. But I would argue, and this would be a tooth and nail argument eventually, that every single idea in Otherwise Than Being is prefigured in Totality and Infinity. Everything. And very often the very vocabulary. So people go, oh, no, saying never said is Otherwise Than Being. No, saying never said is Totality and Infinity. Right? And you just think, I can't believe, how could Levinas have known that when he lays out Ilia, that this is going to be the foundation of his entire philosophy? Right? How could he know that? How could he know in 1947 when he's writing Existence and Existence that it's going to, but it did. It went there. It's one of the most remarkable intellectual developments. I don't know what's comparable. I think after Kant writes his first critique, you could say, the second critique follows from it, and then the third critique, then the religion within the bounds of reason. Maybe you could say all that. Possibly, I don't know. But it took him a long time. There is a break between the first critique and everything he was doing before that. And there's nothing wrong with having a break in your thinking and coming up with a new idea and rejecting your old ideas. But with Levinas, it's a miracle. So I'm not claiming credit when I look at this sentence, or when Paul looks at it, we got it all from that sentence. We learned how to see that sentence. Yeah, I'm sorry. So let's give Lynn Ma her shot.
Actually, I have a question. So,
Yes, yes.
just now said everything nevertheless has to say other than being is preceded to tend to infinity. So what is the essential difference between these two works?
I think in Otherwise Than Being, he turns back to the subject that is vulnerable to responsibility. Whereas in Totality Infinity, he's more interested in bringing out the transcendence of the other. So that the effort in Totality Infinity is to break with the history of the philosophy of self-presence and the philosophy of immanence, and therefore to powerfully present otherness. When he gets to Otherwise Than Being, having already accomplished that, he's more interested on how does responsible subjectivity, how does the self-sensing that he laid out in section 2 respond? What is it to respond responsibly? So that the seminar that we're doing is on the origin of responsibility. So we have to do Totality and Infinity, but we would eventually want to go to Otherwise Than Being to talk about what is responsibility? What is responsibility?
So you don't think there's a self-criticism in Otherwise Than Being? I think there's a strong self-criticism, especially the identity of the self, because here there's still, like, we are still talking about the being of the I. In Otherwise Than Being, there's no being. The drawing is nullified. It's not there anymore.
Let me say what I think the second difference is, then I'll come back to what you said. The second difference, I think, is that there's a greater attentiveness in Otherwise Than Being to language, to the role of language in thinking. Now, having said both of those things, to go back to your question, it is a disservice to Levinas to not realize when he writes and thinks his later writings that he is not presupposing the presence of all of his previous writings. So he doesn't have to go on with the language of being and ontology. He's already done that. The fact that he doesn't do it doesn't mean he's rejecting it. He's saying that work has been done. I'm building now. I'm building. I'm moving on.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's an auto-critique in there.
But
I think there's a development.
deny the drawing then, because in Otherwise Than Being, he indeed denied the drawing. He was saying
he acquiesces to some of the feminist critique that it might not have been as well advised as possible to use the notion of a feminine presence. But as to the functioning of the feminine presence, it's there. It stays. Nothing gets dropped. Yeah, it's all there. In fact, as it were, there's a sort of in-your-face, later Levinas, the notion of maternity. He doesn't back down. That is the central image of the other in the self, the for the other, is maternity. So he has more intellectual courage than almost any thinker I know of. And again, when something fades from his thought, it doesn't fade from his thought. That is, every once in a while you'll see him footnote the Iliad article. Because I think he got a little nervous that people were thinking that he had moved on. Because he rarely footnotes himself. He could constantly footnote himself. When I'm reading Otherwise Than Being, I'm referencing all the connections to Totality Infinity. When I'm in Totality Infinity, I'm referencing all the connections to Otherwise Than Being. It's just the cross-reference between those two books. So I see no radical trade, although I know some commentators of Levinas have argued that there is one. I think, frankly, they're wrong. I think it's a misreading.
How about the self then? Because there's no essence at all, because it's beyond essence. It's here, there you can still
This is
like
beyond
this.
essence.
But because the self is kind of self-referring, not self-referring, but it's like coming back to itself.
No, it's an emptying of itself. You'll see when we do the face. It's an emptying.
That's why you have yourself, then you empty, or you never have yourself. You always empty. It's different because there's no restlessness. In interiority, there's no restlessness.
No, there is restlessness.
It's this quietude, but it's not restlessness.
I would say you could take the two books and just attach Otherwise Than Being at the end of this, and just instead of having only how many pages, you could have the other one together and just roll right on. That's how I see it. So when you say restlessness, what I say is that in Otherwise Than Being, he goes back, as I said, to the traumatized responsible self and gives us a better description, a better characterization, a more fuller, richer account of it.
Sure, the aim is the same. Just say like.
No, but he doesn't discard anything. There's nothing that he has to say, oh, I shouldn't have said, like Heidegger feels like that perhaps Einstein was maybe a little bit too subjectively oriented because of the preeminence of Dasein. You could argue against Heidegger on that point. You can say that he's wrong.
He's famous for having a briefcase where every day he put notes about what he did wrong in being in time.
Ah, okay. And this briefcase disappeared, probably. But I don't think Levinas would have such a briefcase.
How about like the self is not vulnerable to the other? I mean, it's not like, it's like I welcome in the other, but in that sense, this asymmetrical relationship doesn't put the I in a vulnerable. It's more like.
I think you sometimes see certain shifting in emphasis. For instance, in Totality and Infinity, I think Levinas was more attracted to the image of the teacher, the other as teacher.
Yeah.
And then you don't find that in Otherwise Today. It's not that it's a wrong image. I think it just wasn't as fruitful as he wanted. He had already done it. He finished it. He moves on to other images. But there's nothing wrong with the image. And I feel the same way with everything else in it. There's no rejection of what it's not that he says, oh, I really misled you here, I'm sorry. Which is nothing wrong to say something like that. I just don't see it. He drops the teacher thing. He does sort of drop this welcome thing because perhaps it's a little bit too active. But this is not a radical shift. It's just, it's like, what's a more successful? And also, his very notion of philosophy as saying and unsaying, he has to keep, treading, what is the word? He has to, sort of do an exegesis of an exegesis and then an exegesis of that exegesis. He has to do that. Again, not a criticism. It's a reviving. It's a reinvigoration. It's a re-saying. It's reanimation is Husserl's term. A reanimation. That's what he's constantly doing. Reanimating. So I mean, maybe I'm wrong. You can show me. If you see a radical break here, I'd be the first to.
But I think there's also the overbidding of himself.
The
overbidding of himself.
Oh, he has to overbid. Yeah, there is a certain
maybe that's better
decadence.
because criticism is kind of wrong even just in his term. He doesn't like, it's overbidded.
Well, that's the danger of hyperbole, that we get jaded. But I think he made it to the end and kept alive. If you want to see overbidding, you read Sade. Sade cannot overbid himself enough.
He
right?
said he used this method all the time when he was writing. When Levinas was writing Otherwise, I mean, he said he's using overbidding.
But overbidding is okay. But it's a question of whether, is it decadent? See, I don't think it's decadent in the case of Levinas. If you overbid for the sake of overbidding, that is for the shock effect somehow, then it's decadent. It doesn't work. But I don't see anything that doesn't work in Levinas. I don't say to myself, how can he use the word trauma here? He doesn't know what trauma is. I think, that's a deep understanding.
Overbidding is going extreme, going to the superlative.
I know it. It's going to the superlative, it's like hyperbole, but I'm saying that the question about overbidding is, when is it decadent? And I'm saying I don't see that Levinas's overbidding is decadent. That is, it each time animates. I don't think it exaggerates. I don't think it distorts. That would be the danger of overbidding, that you've distorted your thought for the sake of the effect. And there are many thinkers who do that. I mean, particularly contemporary thinkers. But I don't, it doesn't work that way for me. I'm reading Levinas, I'm thinking, wow, what a great way to say this again. But I know, as I said, there are people who want to argue there's this break, and I argue against it.
Not break, but just say going to another superlativeness, because now even the self is empty. There's no going. Just another level.
I think this is something the philosophers usually do. I mean, it's not worth writing the same book over and over again. It's about rethinking about what you have read. It's about putting things in other terms. It's about different contexts. So
that's what I'm saying. Like, it's not like a break, but it's like
overbid.
overbid.
The There may
But it's
not-
overbidding from the start.
Yeah.
The first sentence is overbidding.
Yeah, it's going into permit.
You know, actually, interestingly enough, you know the opening sentence, the famous sentence about the importance of knowing whether we're duped or not by morality.
Right.
If you look, the last page of Otherwise in Being, he brings back the word duped. Who would separate these books? Right?
Yeah.
He doesn't use that. It's deliberately done. I don't want to turn him into a god, but there's just but there is a phenomenal development in his consistency in his
Have
thought.
desire to do it.
I have never worked my way out of his thoughts. Anyway,
Can we go back to the?
well, I don't know if you,
Yeah.
Lynn, you have.
Can I have the one
Yes,
following
yes.
up to the page 149?
Yeah.
Here we have just mentioned about suicide.
Yes.
And there's a sentence in italic, say one flees life to life. One, would you like to elaborate?
I think we have said this about,
Yeah.
that's what connects suicide and
But
sacrifice.
Well, because this section is about enjoyment and separation. So I'm thinking actually here we can summarize the idea is actually the enjoyment, the happiness of enjoyment is to bring the transcendence of the other in life. And the question to me is how? Allow me to repeat again. The happiness of enjoyment, we talk about enjoyment, is to bring the transcendence of the other in life. The question is how, and I found out actually the sacrifice-oriented suicide can give very good examples. Here to me that, I'm not sure it's correct, if I'm wrong, correct me, there are 3 existential movements in this bringing transcendence of life, of the other in life. Yes, there are acts of fleeing. The first 3 acts: act of fleeing, and act of separating, and act of transcending. In terms of suicide for the others, you have sacrifice for the other. Number one, if you want,
I wouldn't say suicide for the other.
well, but sacrifice.
Oh,
You have
okay.
sacrifice-oriented suicide, which connects absoluteness of that kind of happiness, of enjoyment. Because in that sense, number one, you have the act of fleeing from the egoism first. You want to have that sacrifice-oriented suicide. You got to have fleeing, that existential movement come out first. And because that's act of fleeing, it comes, and consequence of act of fleeing would be the separating of the I and the other. And that's the eternal separations. And that separating of I, that's egoism, comes to the transcending the egoism in the I to the life, the ethical life that Levinas is talking about. And the suicide is the case connected absolutely to the sacrifice of the other, to bring the absolute transcendence of the other in life. It's happiness, absolute happiness of enjoyment.
How does the suicide do that?
Because it's giving your life to the others.
No, but that's sacrifice, that's dying for the other. That's very different than suicide.
I'm talking about the sacrifice oriented. So you are thinking of the otherness,
Right.
and which is separating your I, that's egoism, toward the other. That means that relation, transcendental relation toward the other, the desire for the other.
Yeah.
So that kind of sacrifice-oriented suicide has kind of fulfillment of that enjoyment to the others in terms of that transcendental distance.
I don't see that, but that's
Well,
what the other is.
I think
I'm not
maybe
following.
a problem in translation, but in one sense you would have a nice ultimate version of suicide. Stavrogan at the end of Dostoevsky's The Possessed. He's cut himself off completely from all others. He's bored to death, he commits suicide. That's very different than a sacrifice, where you, like you say, you fulfill yourself through the sacrifice for the other. Somebody, there's all sorts of references here, like everybody in France in the 1940s and 50s to the resistance. Somebody who allows himself to be tortured by the Nazis and doesn't, Sartre talks about this all the time. That's sacrifice. Suicide would be quite different.
We're distinguishing.
But in each case, you have it's in the face of the other, because in the one, it's more like marching aside. It's denial. The other has that kind of influence. This is what you were bringing up about the idea. I'm going to harm a whole lot of people with my suicide. But, I'm asserting myself.
End of the
I'm
world.
making the world.
End of the world.
But
I would separate happiness from the issue of dying for, although I would attach it to suicide, so that in the case of suicide, as we said earlier, it's a kind of economic calculation that there will not be sufficient enjoyment in the future that I would continue in this existence, and therefore I'll cash out. That is, my happiness is simply not going to come about, so I'm saying goodbye to it. Personal decision, narcissistic, about the economy of my enjoyment. Whereas in the case of dying for the other, happiness is not an issue. In this way, Levinas is very Kantian.
But he said the tragic character of suicide and sacrifice advances the radicality of love of life. He said very obviously. So there is
the trend.
But in two different ways.
Yeah, that's right.
after, he said
But the
that
tragic character of suicide
and
and
the
of sacrifice
sacrifice
convinces
enhances
the
the radicality
radicality.
of love.
Right, and that was my point, that is,
Yeah.
on the one hand, both suicide and sacrifice indicate the enjoyment of life.
Yeah,
That
because
is, no one wants to die for
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
else, and people commit suicide because they don't think they're going to enjoy life. That's what that sentence
Right.
means. But in order to distinguish these two things, I would say that suicide is an issue of happiness, economically conceived, a calculation that the balance is going to be much more unhappy than happy, and therefore I'm out of here. As opposed to dying for somebody, which has nothing to do with my happiness, but rather with the happiness of the other.
Well, I think there's a phrase in here that contradicts you, and I think this is a
But let's keep in mind too, I don't mind being contradicted, I'm waiting for it in one moment, but Levinas will be discussing these things at length elsewhere, so let's not get obsessed over passing references, okay? Go on.
no way. But this is a big problem for me too. This fragment, and it states here. So only a being already capable of sacrifice is capable of suicide.
Yeah.
So in some way, suicide comes later. In some way, you first need to be able to sacrifice
it's
yourself.
not empirical. It's
in
like
order
a
to-
condition. It's like the whole Darwin is conditioned by the exteriority.
Yeah, but
So
I
it's
think what he's
conditioned.
saying here, though, is that you're able to choose against life. It's in the, if you read the first part of that sentence, it says existence is already metaphysical. You've already put a
it's
meaning,
already-
you've already separated
Yeah,
enough
yeah,
to reflect and put a meaning on this
It's
thing.
the exterior is already there. It's not like to say here there's no exterior. It's,
Well,
it's
I don't
there.
understand how is it already there in suicide. This is what we have talked about the whole time. So for me, let's just say this phrase contradicts everything we just said on suicide.
How so?
Because I can't see how only a being already capable of sacrifice is capable of suicide. I would say that you don't need a being to be capable of sacrifice in order to be capable of committing suicide. I mean, it's a lot more easy to get to the conclusion that life is going to bring you more pain than enjoyment, and you take your life. But
Okay, but the previous sentence, you would also object to the previous sentence. Suicide appears as a possibility to a being already in relation with the other. You're suggesting that suicide can be thought independent of the relation to the other. But keep in mind, nothing in Levinas is thought independent of the relation to the other.
I agree. But how is the relation of suicide to the other? This is my question.
Can I say there's another sentence after this you can read. It is to define him like capable of living for that, and of being on the basis of the other who is exterior to him. Actually, even Ilya is exterior to him. So we didn't talk about the Ilya can be the other in some sense, but he doesn't. It's not the ethical other. So I think he doesn't cut this to say I'm myself. There is the.
Actually, Ilya is also in relation to the other.
Yeah. So that's why it's always on the basis of the other. So even suicide is.
There's no escaping that in it.
Yeah.
Everything is in relation to the other. So that the Ilya is in a relation to the other because it's the dissolution of the illusion of a self-contained immanence. That is, we can't even pull off that. Why? Because of the Ilya. And therefore the Ilya forces people back into relationship with one another because no world can be created as a fortress sufficient that it will not be eroded. He says the word corroded by the Ilya. So let alone suicide, even the Ilya is going to be in relationship to the other.
Yeah.
So suicide, most certainly, there's no doubt that suicide takes on meaning, as I've said 3 times now, for the survivors. So even if the person thinks they're committing the suicide out of completely narcissistic, my life is so miserable, I can't go on, or struggle, and it's nothingness, the burden, I can't take it. What can you do? Levinas says you can't, you can only rebel against the relation to the other, but you're already in relation to the other. And so your suicide will mean things to others. It will mean things to others.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
And I can now better understand what he means when he says one flees life toward life.
Right.
Because this means that you cannot possibly escape life. You cannot escape life, not even by taking your life.
And remember what we read from Bergson here.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't flee life to nothingness. You replace life with another form of life.
There's no way out of life because even the act of suicide confirms the relationship to life, the relationship to others.
And the beauty, that's the beauty, because unlike Sartre's no exit, which is no exit from solitude, for Levinas there's no exit from the other. What does Levinas say? You're persecuted by the other. Right? You're obsessed by the other. Yeah.
I don't want to dwell on this comment and disagree with
You brought the face in. You bad boy. Bad boy.
No, we can talk about that later. I just say, I disagree with your meeting and start.
Okay.
Actually, I would have liked to leave this topic of suicide, but since we have got some discussion, I would like to add 2 sentences. I think when Levinas says that the sacrifice of first, or always someone who can sacrifice, can suicide, he's not talking about with the same identical separated being first sacrifice, and then he's not talking in terms of then the possibilities of one separated being, but he's talking about kind of metaphysical order, if we can use this word. So it's like what is the most primordial is this relation to the other, is this possibility of sacrifice, and that suicide is the derivative of this first primordial metaphysical order. Sacrifice is the first order of things, while suicide is the derivative from it. So it does mean that one separate being first has to sacrifice itself, and then suicide itself is not looking in this kind of context.
Just at the end of this page is a very interesting phrase, another one, and it says, it is uniquely with reference to this agreeableness unsurpassable within the interiority, for it constitutes it, that the world can appear hostile, to be negated, and to be conquered.
Yeah,
so it's the idea that this agreeableness is unsurpassable within interiority.
We begin as enjoyment.
And we end as enjoyment even in the act of suicide.
There's no escaping it.
This is interesting.
You can't step outside yourself.
Because this agreement, this agreeableness constitutes the I.
It's an enchainment. You're enchained to yourself.
Устава сделала на дорогу, I чуешь, mommy coffee.
I know.
Coffee.
Coffee, we have no coffee. We ran out of coffee.
I social walking.
We have no coffee. Here is someone.
I social work, I give for man on bills.
That's what, here's someone who's going to speak to
I
you.
social work, I give.
Good.
I can get coffee.
No, we have no coffee.
Ah.
No tweet.
The other.
The other.
Gentle presence of the other.
Gentle presence. Gentle presence of the other. You wanted coffee. If we had coffee, we'd give her coffee.
Yeah.
We don't have any coffee.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, now let's move to the topic of suicide. So now I'm moving to another small issue of this section. So after this brief remark on suicide and sacrifice, Levinas points out that the relation between existence and the world is not primarily oppositional. He's talking about the relation between existence, between the law and the world. So it's not primarily oppositional but agreeable. Agreeable. Oppositional relation is derived from the agreeable relation. So here, agreeable may also imply acceptance of what we live for. And this is where, according to Levinas, gentleness or intimacy is wrong. After affirming the priority of enjoyment in life and agreeable relation with the world, Levinas comes to talk about the disquietude. So he only mentioned disquietude only after some paragraphs he comes back to this theme of disquietude, which is experienced as the concern for the moral. In order to master the uncertainty and disquietude of the future, labor delineates a separation in the form of economic independence. This manifests concretely for Levinas in habitation, in dwelling, or a home. And now we come to the last two paragraphs. In the second to last paragraph, Levinas reiterates a radical opposition against, so very clearly, against the Hegelian sense of the other, with which the same or maybe participate in the other, and finally achieve reconciliation through a dialectical movement. We need to understand Levinas' writing against this the same as depicted here in terms of separation starts from the very beginning as a peaceful, so it's a peaceful relation with the other. Opposition and the war is secondary of this welcoming of the other, which is produced primordially in the gentleness of the feminine face. So here I see some, I'm not sure if it's a disturbance or some difference, because just now we talked about the shock after the other chose to use himself in the shock. But here, Levinas is speaking of the welcoming of the other shows itself first in the gentleness of the feminine face. So it's a peaceful relation between self and the world. So it's not a shock. I think he says some to this effect. So I have last question to be discussed. So on page 150, the last two paragraphs of the last two sentences of the second paragraph, so 150. So here, Levinas says, by virtue of its intentional structure, gentleness comes to the separated being from the other. The other precisely reveals himself in his authority, not in a show negating the eye, but as a primordial phenomenon of gentleness. So my first question says, we talked about the show, but here she says it's not in the show, but in a primordial phenomenon of gentleness. So how to understand this difference between us? And the second question is, and also is the other here, is it analogous with the other of the other person, especially in otherwise than being the other that accuses and persecutes the self, or is it derived or is it derivative or derived from the latter, from the other that persecutes the self? So what are the relation differences?
Because of time and because the next section is exactly on these questions, let's put this off till next class. So thank you for your presentation. I would have told you not to do the Latin paragraphs because it's a preparation for the next section. So we will raise the question of what is the status of this gentle alterity in contrast to the full ethical other. And it's an interesting question for next class. We are 10 minutes after 5. Many of us are going to get together tonight at the Aula, so you all should know where it is. You should look it up on your Google Maps and things like that. And unless there are pressing needs, the same as yesterday, yes. So we'll just end for today. Thank you. We'll see you tonight and tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.